Hello, fellow night owls. Tonight we dive into the beautiful yet brutal time period that was feudal Japan. Relax your mind and body as we dive into the intricate world of warlords, samurai, and cherry blossoms, and uncover what made this time period a bountiful well of radiant culture and innovation, but also oppressive feudal systems and constant warfare that made life brutal for the many average Samaritans just trying to scrape by. But before we begin, please take a moment to let us know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is, as it's always fascinating to see how far these stories reach. Well, get comfortable. Let your eyes slowly get heavier and heavier as we take a trip to feudal Japan through historical accounts and intimate stories. Let us begin. The story of the Tanaka family illustrates the precarious position of many merchants in feudal Japan. Though their class was slowly gaining economic clout, they still found themselves near the bottom of the social hierarchy, subject to heavy taxes and restrictions. For the Tanakas, running a small kimono shop in Edo, life was a constant struggle to stay afloat. Long days were spent hunched over bolts of fine silk, carefully cutting and stitching the elegant garments. The whole family toiled together, with even the youngest children helping to mix dyes and wind thread. Though their wares were worn by noble ladies, the Tanakas themselves subsisted on meager meals of millet and pickled radish. Every spare coin was reinvested in the business, but skyrocketing silk prices and the heavy taxes levied by the shogun ate away at their slim profits. The Tanakas lived in constant fear of falling behind on payments and having their shops seized. Bribes to corrupt officials became just another cost of doing business. To make matters worse, the family harbored a dangerous secret. They were closet Christians in a time when the foreign faith was strictly forbidden. If discovered, they risked torture and execution as enemies of the state. But their beliefs were a comfort in their hard lives, and they cherished their hidden rosaries and whispered prayers. It's hard to fathom the level of oppression feudal Japanese society imposed on those of the lower classes. Not only did poverty and backbreaking toil define their existence, but a rigid code of conduct controlled virtually every aspect of their behavior and appearance. Strict sumptuary laws laid out in minute detail what each social rank could wear, eat, and own. Peasants and merchants were explicitly banned from wearing silk, bright colours, or ornate hairstyles. The size and materials of their homes and furnishings were likewise prescribed. These petty regulations ensured that the elite could never be confused for commoners. But the conformity and control pressed further than outward appearances. Frivolous entertainments like theatre, music, and dancing were frowned upon as debased and immoral. Public displays of affection were considered shameful. Proper etiquette had to be observed at all times, with numerous rituals for everything from serving tea to greeting superiors. A culture of restraint and puritanism pervaded society, especially among the samurai. Overt shows of emotion were deeply unseemly for the warrior class, who were expected to face all of life's trials with stoic endurance. One slip in decorum could mean a loss of face and reputation. For women, the restrictions were even more suffocating. Demure obedience and selfless service were the highest virtues of a proper lady. An idealized beauty was one of a pale, slender figure wrapped in voluminous kimono, with every hair and fold perfectly in place. This was the stifling world of Hana, a young geisha in training. To the men she entertained, she was the picture of feminine subservience and artful grace. She could pour sake and deliver witty conversation with a carefully cultivated air of elegant mystery. But inside, Hana chafed at the austere code of conduct that governed her every move. As a geisha, her appearance was strictly regulated, from the tilt of her shimada hairstyle to the shade of red on her lips. She once dared to wear a purple kimono reserved for higher-ranking geisha and was severely punished, confined to her quarters for days. Another time, Hannah allowed herself to return the flirtatious affections of a charming young client. But when the tea house mistress caught wind of it, she was harshly beaten as a reminder that geisha were never to be mistaken for common prostitutes. A geisha's allure was in her untouchable beauty, not her availability. As the years passed, Hannah grew increasingly disillusioned with the false realm of the flower and willow world. She was essentially an indentured servant, her body and talents owned by the okiya that had invested in her training. There was no room for real love or free choices. She began to long for independence as an ordinary wife and mother, but knew the chances were slim. Instead, she numbed her hidden sorrows with stolen sips of sake when no one was looking. For even displaying a drinking problem would be a disgraceful break in character. Of course, for commoners who ran afoul of the law, the consequences were infinitely harsher than a few snide remarks. The feudal justice system was concerned more with keeping order and control than any pretense of impartial process. Laws were strict, guilt was assumed, and punishments were brutal and swift. Minor offences routinely drew harsh corporal punishment. Pickpockets and vandals could expect public floggings, their skin flayed until they passed out from the pain. Thieves and adulterers often had noses or ears lopped off as a permanent mark of shame. Serious crimes met with horrific torture and execution. The techniques were various and prolonged: boiling, sawing, bludgeoning with heavy rods. Crucifixion involved tying the condemned to a cross and spearing them through repeatedly with razor-sharp bamboo shoots. Perhaps most infamous was death by grilling, a method reserved for arsonists and murderers. The convict would be tied spread eagle as hot coals were piled on their body, slowly roasting them over several agonizing days. Their charred limbs might be hacked off one by one until merciful death arrived. Pity the hungry young peasant who dared to filch a fish from the market. After the briefest of trials, he received 30 lashes with a wooden paddle, the vicious beating leaving him delirious and half dead. But as a repeat offender, his fate was likely sealed. Petty theft carried a sentence of beheading under the Tokugawa. Indeed, the threat of gruesome punishment loomed over all those without rank or connections. Judicial torture was regularly used to extract confessions, whether the accused was guilty or not. Tokugawa law explicitly stated it was better to convict an innocent man than let a guilty one go free. With virtually no rights or due process, commoners were helpless if charged with a crime, at the whim of daimyos and magistrates. False accusations were commonly leveled to remove political rivals or seize property and assets. Justice was utterly arbitrary for those without power. And so the spectre of the law was just one more weight bearing down on the backs of the people. Their lives were defined by endless toil and deprivation, with only the slimmest hope of rising above their assigned station. For the peasants who made up the vast majority, poverty ground them down to the literal dirt. Punishing taxes and rice levies left little to fill their bellies. They subsisted on millet gruel and radish tops, watching their lords feast on white rice and venison. Crushing debts piled up season after backbreaking season. Many became essentially slaves, bonded to their land and landlord. If their rice harvest fell short, their children might be sold into servitude to pay the difference. A bad crop could spell disaster for a whole village. When famine struck, peasants ate grass and bark to survive. Bands of gaunt, desperate vagrants roamed the roads. Abandoned children wailed in empty huts. Corpses piled in ditches. Relief was paltry and selective. The poor died in droves when disease burned through. Smallpox and dysentery churning one on top of malnutrition. They could only pray to Jizo and Kannon, the merciful bodhisattvas, for salvation from suffering in the next life. Opportunities for a better lot were vanishingly rare. The rigid class boundaries were nearly impossible to jump without being born into privilege. Education was limited to basic ciphering and calligraphy, learned at a temple school, if that. For most, the only path was the backbreaking one their fathers and grandfathers walked. Is it any wonder, then, that some peasants reached a breaking point? That after a string of poor harvests, a village might rise up in raw desperation, even knowing the futility? Such was the case in 1781, when starving farmers in the Tohoku region attacked tax collectors and stormed their daimyo's castle, demanding relief from rice levies. Hundreds more flocked to join them, seizing weapons and torching government storehouses. But like every peasant rebellion, this one was doomed. The uprising dissolved in the face of trained samurai. The farmers fled to the mountains. The daimyo ordered all the village men beheaded as an example, their wives and daughters sold into prostitution, and so the peasants submitted again, backs bent under the knowledge that they could rage against their fate, but never escape it. They prayed for the distant promise of the world turned upside down, when the virtuous poor would become lords in the Buddha's paradise. And the feudal order groaned on for another century, but the weight of its oppression grew heavier. The merchants and artisans grew restless, their coin buying them fine things, but not respect. The samurai found their way of life threatened, their rituals of blood and honor ringing hollow. Cracks spidered through the foundation, the fury and desperation of millions upon whose stooped backs the elite few perched in splendor. And when the quake of foreign powers rattled Japan's gates, the great edifice of the Tokugawa finally toppled into dust and ruin. Looking back, it's hard to fathom the scale of human suffering that defined feudal Japanese life for all but the most privileged. The conformity and control bore down from every angle. The clothes on one's back, the wood of one's house, every tugged forelock and bitten tongue. The constant spectre of war, famine, and punishment. The rigid hierarchy deeming you base or noble by accident of birth, a fate not to be questioned. Modernity has brought its own horrors and iniquities, but reflecting on the past, there is some comfort in knowing that great change is possible, that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can crumble, that we can dare to imagine a society of justice and dignity for all. The feudal peasant, toiling to the end of his days in a world of blades and hunger, would scarcely believe it. So if you enjoyed this journey through the darker annals of history, consider liking and subscribing for more. There are countless shadowed chapters still to explore, the blood-soaked ground on which our present is built. But for now, let it lull you into an appreciate sleep. And may all your waking dreams be kinder than the long nightmares of the past. The harsh justice system of feudal Japan was a reflection of the rigid social hierarchy and the importance placed on maintaining order and control. In a society where one's station was determined by birth and there was little room for social mobility, the laws were designed to keep people firmly in their place. Minor crimes that today might warrant a fine or short jail sentence were punished severely. Petty theft, gambling, and disorderly conduct often resulted in public floggings, leaving the accused bloodied and battered as a warning to others. More serious offences like repeated larceny or forgery could lead to the loss of a hand or even beheading. Trials were swift and largely a formality, with little presumption of innocence. Suspects were often tortured to elicit confessions, the belief being that an innocent person would never admit to a crime they didn't commit, even under duress. Samurai had the privilege of being tried by their peers in a warrior court, but commoners had no such rights. Punishments were meted out publicly to maximize their impact as deterrents. Crucifixion was the cruelest fate, reserved for treason and other high crimes against the state. The condemned would be lashed to a wooden cross and pierced with spears, left to die an agonizing, drawn-out death. Their corpses would be left on display for days as a grim reminder of the price of defiance. One small mercy was the practice of death by proxy, where a family member could request to be executed in place of their loved one. This spared the condemned from suffering and allowed them an honorable end. But it was a tragic choice that only the desperately loyal would make. Consider the tale of Hikaru, a young artisan's apprentice in the city of Osaka. His master was a skilled but ill-tempered swordsmith, prone to heavy drinking and fits of rage. One evening, when his master was berating him harshly over a minor infraction, Hikaru snapped and struck him with a tool, fracturing his skull. Hikaru was swiftly arrested and thrown in a dank prison cell to await trial. He was denied food and water, kept in darkness, and interrogated mercilessly by his captors. Exhausted and disoriented, he eventually confessed to the attack under the threat of torture. At his trial, Hikaru's guilt was presumed from the start. His tearful pleas that it was an accident and his appeals to his master's good character fell on deaf ears. With the swordsmith hovering near death, the judge wasted little time in reaching a verdict. Hikaru would face crucifixion for his crime. On the day of his execution, Hikaru was pale and shaking as he was paraded through the streets and lashed to the cross. As the executioners prepared to pierce him with spears, Hikaru's elderly father came forward and prostrated himself before the magistrate. With his face pressed to the ground, he begged to take his only son's place on the cross, insisting that his own life was near its end, while Hikaru's was just beginning. With great sorrow, the magistrate agreed to the substitution, acknowledging the father's noble sacrifice. Hikaru wailed as he watched his father, the man who had always protected him, be put to a torturous death in his stead. The guilt was more painful than the spears would have been. He would go on to live a long life as a master swordsmith himself, but he was forever haunted by the cost of that second chance. Stories like Hikaru's were all too common in feudal Japan, where a single misstep could doom an entire family. The cruel and unyielding justice system was just one more way the powerful exerted control over the masses. It was a constant reminder that in this society, people were ultimately expendable cogs in service of the larger machine. For the peasants and artisans who made up the bulk of the population, life was an endless cycle of toil and hardship, with little hope of reprieve. They were born into poverty and would likely die in it, never knowing a life beyond back-breaking labor in the fields or hunched over a workbench. The lucky ones might enjoy a modest existence, with enough to eat and a roof over their heads, but they walked a razor's edge, always one failed harvest or broken contract away from destitution. A single stroke of misfortune could cast a family into starvation and ruin. Consider the Ito family, humble rice farmers, in a small village near Kyoto. For generations, they had tended the same small plot of land, barely eking out a living. They lived simply in a tiny thatch hut, subsisting on a diet of mostly rice and vegetables, with the occasional fish or scrap of meat. The father, Toshi, was a stoop-shouldered man who had known nothing but toil since he could walk. Each day, he rose before dawn to tend the rice paddies, planting, weeding, and watering until his hands were rough and muddied. His wife May worked alongside him while also caring for their 3 small children and aging parents. Despite their best efforts, the Ito family lived in a state of constant precariousness. More than half their rice harvest went to paying rents and taxes to their local lord. What remained was barely enough to fill their bellies and trade for other necessities. They were one flood or drought away from disaster. That ill fortune came in the summer of 1783, when a powerful typhoon tore through their region, flattening fields and destroying storehouses. The Ito's entire rice crop was wiped out, along with their seed stock for the next planting. They suddenly faced the very real prospect of starvation. With heavy hearts, Toshi and May made the difficult decision to sell their young daughter Akari into indentured servitude with a wealthy merchant family. It was the only way to keep the rest of the family fed. They told themselves it was temporary, that they would work hard and save every spare coin to one day buy back her freedom. but deep down, they knew it might be the last they ever saw of their bright-eyed girl. Akari's story was tragically common in feudal Japan, where the crushing poverty ensnared families for generations. Children were often commodities to be sold or traded in times of hardship. Many rural girls ended up trafficked to city brothels and tea houses, forever losing their innocence to keep their families afloat a little longer. This was the unrelenting reality for the peasantry, a never-ending struggle for survival that stripped away dignity and hope. They were the human fuel that kept the feudal machine lurching forward, their suffering greasing the gears for the benefit of the ruling class far above. And so life ground on for the masses, a timeless cycle of hard labor, deprivation, and quiet despair, their fates dictated by the accident of birth. It would take a fundamental reordering of society for there to be any dreams beyond the unforgiving fields and the never-satisfied tax collector. But such change would be a long time coming. In the 15th century, a new philosophy began to take hold among the ruling elite that would further codify the rigid social hierarchy. Neo-Confucianism, as it was known, preached that social harmony depended on everyone knowing their proper place and dutifully fulfilling their role, no matter how lowly. At the top of this divine pecking order was the emperor, who reigned but did not rule. He was seen as a godlike figure, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, but held little practical power. That was wielded by the shogun, the supreme military leader who ruled in the emperor's name. Below the shogun were the daimyo, the feudal lords who controlled vast estates and armies of samurai. Though subordinate to the shogun, the daimyo enjoyed wide autonomy in their domains, essentially functioning as kings. They were expected to keep the peace, collect taxes, and provide military service when called upon. At the bottom were the peasants, artisans, and merchants, the vast majority of the population. Neo-Confucian thought held that they were inherently inferior to the samurai class above them, and that their only path to virtue was through obedience and service. Nowhere were these oppressive ideas more enthusiastically embraced than in Edo, the seat of the shogunate. There, conformity was the highest ideal, and any deviation from societal norms was seen as a threat to the natural order. The Tokugawa shoguns, who ruled Japan for over 250 years, were enthusiastic proponents of Neo-Confucianism. They used it to justify their authoritarian rule and the strict sumptuary laws that dictated every aspect of daily life. Commoners were told what they could wear, what they could eat, even what kind of houses they could live in based on their station. Peasants were forbidden from wearing silk and had to make their clothes from rough hemp or cotton. Merchants, though increasingly wealthy from trade, were banned from flaunting their success. Even the well-bred geisha were bound by countless rules governing their appearance and behavior. The political scheming and intrigue common in Kyoto and Osaka were muted in Edo, where an absolute adherence to decorum reigned. Samurai swaggered through the streets, secure in their privileged status, while commoners bowed and scraped. Public criticism of the government was forbidden, and informers eagerly reported the slightest hints of rebellion. In this stultifying atmosphere, where etiquette and ritual came before all else, is where we find Haru, a young woman born into the merchant class. Her family ran a small but prosperous shop selling the fine paper used for calligraphy and official documents, giving them a tenuous link to elite society. From a young age, Haru chafed at the limitations placed on her as a woman and a commoner. She was quick-witted and harbored secret ambitions of becoming a scholar, devouring classical texts in her father's storeroom. But such intellectual pursuits were deemed unseemly for a merchant's daughter, who was expected to master the tea ceremony and flower arranging to attract a suitable husband. Haru's parents were loving but firm, impressing upon her the importance of upholding the family's honor and knowing her place. They had sacrificed much to provide her with a genteel upbringing, and could not abide any rebelliousness that might threaten their hard-earned respectability. So Haru learned to hide her true nature behind a mask of quiet obedience. She poured tea and recited poetry with a serene smile, all the while dreaming of a different life. She snuck her precious books under her futon and read them by candlelight, thrilling to the illicit knowledge. Her nightly studies came to an abrupt end when her mother found her stash of subversive texts. They were works by a renegade philosopher who dared to question the prevailing doctrine of blind subservience to authority. Haru's mother was horrified, fearing what would happen if such dangerous ideas were discovered in their home. Haru pleaded that the books were not hers, that she was simply minding them for a friend, but her mother saw through the lies. As punishment, Haru was confined to her room for a month, permitted to leave only to assist in the shop under close supervision. Her books were burned in the courtyard, the ashes scattered to the wind. From that day forward, Haru was chastened into meek compliance, resigned to the restricted path laid before her. She married the son of a fellow merchant, a kind but dull man who shared none of her intellectual curiosity. She bore 3 children and devoted herself to being a model wife and mother, burying her unorthodox dreams deep within. To the outside world, Haru was the picture of a proper Edo woman, graceful and ever obliging. Only in the deepest reaches of the night, lying beside her slumbering husband, did she allow her mind to wander to what might have been, if only she had been born into a different time, a different place, a different body. Haru's story was not unusual in the pressure cooker of Edo society. Conformity was the watchword, and the nail that stuck out was quickly hammered down. With their individuality suppressed and their minds constrained, many simply submitted to the well-worn grooves of tradition and duty. But in remote corners of the archipelago, far from the watchful gaze of the authorities, pockets of resistance smoldered. On the wave-battered islands of the far south, a strange foreign faith was taking root, promising a spiritual liberation from the rigid strictures of feudal life. Catholic missionaries, first welcomed by the shogunate as purveyors of new knowledge and trade, had been violently expelled in the early 1600s. Christianity was banned as a subversive influence, its adherents forced to renounce their beliefs or face torture and execution. Many went underground, forming secret communities bound by faith and necessity. Among them were the hidden Christians of the Shimabara Peninsula, a rugged land of craggy inlets and lush green valleys. For over 2 centuries, they outwardly practiced Buddhism while furtively passing down the rites and rituals of the church. Baptisms were performed in secluded forest glens, masses held in secret after midnight. The villagers of Shimabara eked out a meager living as farmers and fishermen, scratching survival from the stingy soil. They found solace in their clandestine faith, which preached the equality of all before an all-loving God. It was a powerful antidote to the Neo-Confucian orthodoxy that so oppressed their daily lives. Ichiro was born into this world of furtive devotion and constant fear. From a young age, he was taught the importance of keeping the family's true beliefs hidden from outsiders. He learned to recite the Heart Sutra by rote, even as he fervently whispered the Lord's Prayer when no one was listening. As Ichiro grew into manhood, he shouldered ever greater responsibility in his tiny community. He led prayer meetings in hushed seaside caves and officiated weddings with crudely fashioned crosses. To the outside world, he played the part of the earthy fisherman with a ready laugh and a bounty of coarse stories. But Ichiro was forever on guard, knowing that a single slip could bring the authorities crashing down on him and all he held dear. He lived with the ever-present dread of discovery, of failing in his sacred duty to carry the flame of his ancestors' faith. That dreaded day came in the autumn of his 27th year, when a nosy tax collector from the regional capital came sniffing around the village. Repulsed by the poverty and the crude dialect of the locals, the official was eager to find fault and squeeze more wealth from the downtrodden peasants. As the tax collector surveyed the village headman's ramshackle home, he spied something peculiar on the dirt-streaked wall. It was a rough outline of a cross, etched in charcoal and half hidden behind tattered scrolls of Buddhist mantras. With a shout of triumph, the official seized upon this damning evidence of the forbidden faith. When the headman fell to his knees, babbling desperate denials, the cruel bureaucrat only sneered, certain he had unearthed a nest of dangerous heretics. Ichiro watched in dread from the shadows as the tax collector summoned a squad of armed samurai to round up the terrified villagers. He knew he should run, flee into the mountains and live to fight another day, but he could not abandon his flock to face the coming storm alone. With a heavy heart, Ichiro stepped forward into the torchlight. In a calm, clear voice, he declared himself a follower of Christ and a leader of the hidden church. He commanded the trembling headman to stay silent, to protect the others with his mute compliance. Over the shouts of the samurai, Ichiro began to sing a hymn of joyful surrender. As the warriors fell upon him with their clubs, Ichiro rejoiced in the knowledge that his sacrifice would buy precious time for his fellow believers to scatter and regroup. He would gladly bear the coming torments, content in the promise of a glorious reward in the world to come. Ichiro's story was a testament to the quiet, stubborn resistance that persisted in the forgotten corners of feudal Japan. For all the shogunate's ruthless suppression, it could not fully extinguish the spark of spirit that yearned for something more than the stifling confines of the feudal order. But such defiance came at a terrible cost. The hidden Christians of Shimabara were brutally rooted out and executed en masse, their villages razed, and their names blackened in the official histories. It would be many generations before their descendants could practice their faith openly, free from the suffocating pall of persecution. Surveying the panorama of feudal Japan, one can only marvel at the fortitude of those who endured such unrelenting hardship and injustice. From the calloused peasants toiling in the muddy rice fields to the hunched artisans laboring in the smoky cities, life was an unending trial of back-breaking labor and deprivation. The ruling samurai class, for all their lofty pretensions of honor and bushido, were little more than glorified thugs, lording their military might over the cowering masses. Obsessed with rank and protocol, they were quick to take offense and mete out harsh discipline for the slightest breach of their precious codes. Women, already subservient chattel, faced especially dismal prospects. Denied education and agency, they were valued only for their utility as submissive wives and fertile wombs. The heroic few who dared to rebel against their prescribed roles faced crushing ostracization and violence. This was the lot of the common people of feudal Japan, to be born into suffocating obligation, to live in constant scarce. As we've seen, life for the vast majority during the long centuries of feudal Japan was defined by endless toil, deprivation, and a rigid social order that kept people firmly in their place from the moment of birth until death finally released them from their suffering. One of the most striking examples of this entrenched inequality and oppression was the plight of the Burakumin, Japan's untouchable underclass. These were people born into hereditary occupations considered unclean by Buddhist and Shinto tradition, mostly work involving death or the handling of animal flesh, like undertaking, butchery, tanning hides, and leatherwork. Imagine being born into this reviled caste through no choice of your own, your family trapped for generations in a self-perpetuating cycle of discrimination and squalor. You're forced to live in a segregated hamlet on the outskirts of town, a crowded slum of ramshackle huts lacking even the meanest comforts. Forbidden from marrying outside your class, your spouse must come from the same wretched background, ensuring your children are born into the identical fate. Grinding poverty is all but guaranteed when the only occupations open to you are dirty, dangerous, and low-paid. You labour at grim, foul-smelling work from sun-up to sundown and collapse exhausted each night in your bare hovel. When venturing into town on errands, you must wear distinguishing clothing that marks you as untouchable, a straw hat, or a dirty, ragged kimono. In the streets, people recoil from you or yell vicious insults. Shopkeepers charge you inflated prices or refuse to serve your kind at all. Dehumanizing discrimination follows you at every turn. Your children too face constant ostracism and bullying. Other families forbid their sons and daughters from associating with yours. No matter how bright and capable they may be, your offspring are barred from all but the lowliest occupations. They're turned away from schools, apprenticeships, and temples, condemned to the same wretched existence you've known since birth. This is the excruciating reality Saburo Yoshioka was born into in a Burakumin ghetto on the edge of Kyoto in the late 1700s. As a young boy, Saburo chafed at the demeaning restrictions and tried to venture out into the wider city. But when the other children noticed his telltale straw sandals and filthy rags, they taunted him mercilessly, pelting him with pebbles until he fled back to the muddy alleys of the outcast's slum. Saburo's father, like his father before him, eked out a meager living as a leather worker. He took cowhides from local slaughterhouses and tanned them for months in great stinking vats of caustic vegetable tannins, before working the rough leather into sandals, saddles, and scabbards. It was filthy, noxious work, but the only trade open to an untouchable man. From the age of 7, Saburo was put to work in his father's fetid tanning yard. The astringent stench of cow urine and caustic lime permanently saturated his skin and hair. His hands became pocked with putrid sores from the hides soaked in their toxic baths. At the end of long days up to his shins in the tanning pits, he would come home reeking, his lungs seared from the fumes. As Saburo entered manhood, he dreamed of marrying a pretty girl from town, escaping his miserable lot in life. In the spring, he began slipping into Kyoto on market days, hoping to catch the eye of some lovely maiden, but he quickly learned even a friendly smile in his direction was out of the question. The city girls turned up their noses at his stench and scurried away in revulsion, sometimes spitting in his direction to ward off his pollution. Despairing, Saburo finally wed the daughter of the local gravedigger in a perfunctory ceremony, resigning himself to perpetuating another generation of ostracized outcasts. Together they raised 3 children in the same hovel he had grown up in, barely managing to keep them fed by their combined toil at society's foulest tasks. Though a proud man, Saburo was forced to hide his face behind a woven reed hat in town, lest he provoke a torrent of abuse. Once, when he dared look a samurai in the eye, the warrior smashed him in the face with an iron-studded jita, knocking out his front teeth. Saburo had no legal recourse, as the feudal authorities cared little how society's dregs were bullied and brutalized. In this way, Saburo and his family lived out their days in squalid ignominy, toiling at repellent work from dawn to dusk, forever shunned by their fellow man. They were trapped at the very bottom of the social order, their choices and chances extinguished from birth. For generation after generation, the Burakumin moulded in their ghettos, feudal Japan's permanent, untouchable underclass. Of course, life was scarcely less constricted for the peasantry at large. Though spared the extreme stigma of the Burakumin, farm folk too found themselves locked into a bleak station fixed at birth. Serfs bound to the land of their local lord, they enjoyed precious few freedoms beyond the grueling labour that filled their waking hours. Imagine an existence of ceaseless, back-breaking toil from your earliest childhood days onward. You wake each morning on a reed mat, your belly half empty, and stumble out into the muddy fields to guide an ox-drawn plough or plant endless rows of rice seedlings bent double at the waist. Icy water soaks your legs to the bone as you slosh through the paddies, your feet cut and abraded. At the height of the growing season, you're in the fields for 12, 14, 16 hours a day, pausing only for a few meagre meals of millet gruel and pickled radish if you're lucky. Your face and neck are burnt nut brown by the unrelenting sun, your hands gnarled and calloused from gripping tools. A straw hat provides scant relief from the heat as you sweat and strain until every muscle aches. Of course, this assumes the weather is favourable and the harvest plentiful. Let the rains fail or wines lay the crops low, and your family teeters on the precipice of starvation. When the rice runs out, you forage for roots and bark, begging for table scraps on the outskirts of town. Sometimes, you watch helpless as your aged parents or younger siblings waste away, bellies distended, too weak to rise from their pallets. When the rice crop does come in, much of it is destined for your daimyo's storehouses, owed as tax for farming his land. You watch stoically as the best of your back-breaking efforts are carted away by sneering samurai tax collectors. Should you fail to meet your assigned quota, you'll be beaten severely as a malingerer, fined into destitution. Come winter, you shiver in your flea-ridden thatch hut, a single charcoal brazier providing scant warmth as icy winds knife through the walls. You wrap yourself in a tattered, lice-ridden kimono and dream of spring's distant arrival. But you know full well it heralds only a return to the ceaseless, bone-wearying drudgery that has defined every moment of your wretched life. Such was the lot of Kenji Nakamura, born into a poor farming village in the shadow of his daimyo's towering castle near Himeji in the early 1600s. From the age of 5, Kenji was in the rice fields beside his father, doing what he could to contribute to his family's survival. His childhood was an endless blur of blistered hands, aching muscles, and growling hunger. At 13, Kenji watched helpless as his mother wasted away with fever after a meager harvest. Her once strong body reduced to little more than a skeleton wrapped in paper-thin skin. He helped dig her grave in the rocky soil behind their hut, weeping as his father intoned a simple prayer to Amida Buddha for her salvation in the Western paradise. With his mother gone, Kenji took on even more work, rising before dawn to pound millet for gruel, then standing in the frigid paddies until dusk. His youth was a relentless cycle of planting, weeding, frightening away birds, and finally harvesting the precious rice on which the village depended utterly for survival. In a good year, there would be enough to fill their bellies until spring after the tax grain was rendered up. In a bad one, they would huddle in their huts as the snow fell, subsisting on a thin gruel of boiled bark and bran, praying they would not follow their weakest members to the grave before the planting season renewed them. As a young man, Kenji did as was expected of him, and married a plain farmer's daughter from the next village, taking her into his family's hut to bear the next generation of downtrodden tillers bound to their lord's land. She laboured stoically beside him in the fields and rice paddies, even when heavy with child, pausing only to squat in the mud and deliver the next infant. Over the years, Kenji watched 4 of his children succumb to the usual ailments of the peasantry. 2 were carried off by dysentery, 1 by the pox, and another by a wasting cough that left him shaking and drenched in sweat as he gasped out his final rattling breaths. Such losses were expected among the farm folk, inured as they were to the precariousness of life. Kenji counted himself fortunate that 2 of his sons and a daughter survived to adulthood, knowing they would take their place beside him in the never-ending labour of their allotted plot. They would marry, bear children of their own, and one day open a spot in the earth for his weary bones. The cycle of toil, hardship and acceptance would continue unbroken, as it had for generations beyond memory. Looking back over his life from the vantage point of stooped and aching old age, Kenji sometimes wondered if some other existence was possible. He thought of the village headman in his fine silk kimono, the samurai with their polished swords and lacquered armor, the fat merchants who sold his milled rice in the distant city, living lives he could scarcely imagine. But in the end, he accepted that he had lived as his father had lived, and his father before him. He had endured, providing for his family as best he could against the deprivations of an indifferent world. There was a certain hard-won dignity in that. So, from cradle to grave, the peasantry of feudal Japan lived out their humble, circumscribed lives. They were born to their ceaseless labor, married to perpetuate it, and died never knowing anything else. Bent over in the paddies, crouched by smoky hearths, they watch the seasons change and the years roll by, toiling under the watchful gaze of castle keeps and temple spires erected on the fruits of their efforts. They shouldered the burden of their thankless station, scarcely daring to dream of a life less mean. But every so often, a bolder soul would arise, questioning his ordained place and galvanized to action. And as the Edo period lurched toward a chaotic close, those voices of dissent would grow louder, straining against the bonds of the ancient feudal order. One such man was Hideki Ito, a peasant from a hardscrabble village in the mountains of Honshu. Like his fellow farmers, Hideki had known backbreaking labor, gnawing hunger, and arbitrary exploitation at the hands of the samurai class since boyhood. But deep in his breast smoldered the embers of righteous anger at the injustice of his state. When a cruel, new daimyo assumed control of his domain in the 1860s, Hideki found he could bear no more. The daimyo, eager to squeeze every last zeni of productivity from his land, raised taxes to a crippling degree and ordered his samurai to flog farmers who fell behind in their quotas. That year, when an early frost decimated the harvest, he turned a blind eye as his people wasted and starved, unwilling to dip into his ample stores of reserve rice. Simmering with barely suppressed rage, Hideki began meeting with like-minded men from surrounding villages. In the dead of night, they gathered in the woods to vent their anger and contemplate rebellion. At first, such talk terrified Hideki, knowing the ruthlessness with which peasant uprisings were put down. But as he watched his fellows grow ever more gaunt and hollow-cheeked, his own young daughter wilting away, his fury overcame his fear. That spring, Hideki and his band made their move. In a meticulously coordinated strike, they set upon the daimyo's tax collectors as they made their rounds, beating them senseless and seizing their ill-gotten lucre. They raided government storehouses, distributing rice and tools to the jubilant local farmers. Giddy with success, Hideki led his swelling mob toward the daimyo's castle, torches in hand. But he had gravely underestimated the speed and brutality of the ruling class's response. Informed of the uprising, the daimyo dispatched his most ruthless samurai on horseback, armed to the teeth. They rode down upon the rebel mob, trampling men beneath the hooves of their steeds, cutting down others in a whirlwind of flashing swords. The farmers scattered in terror, their farming tools no match for the samurai's blades. In the chaos, Hideki caught sight of the samurai commander, a sneering man astride a black charger. Half mad with righteous fury, Hideki lunged at him, swinging his crude stake with all his might. But the samurai contemptuously knocked it away with his sword, then cleaved Hideki's skull in two with an effortless riposte. Hideki crumpled to the ground, drowning in a crimson torrent, the light fading from his eyes as swiftly as his dreams of a more just world. In the aftermath, the daimyo made a terrible example of the rebel farmers. Dozens were beheaded, their leaders brutally crucified. The village was burnt to the ground, its women and children left to starve in the ashes. The message could not have been clearer. Such defiance would be met with the most pitiless retribution. The social order would be preserved at any cost in blood and suffering. But unbeknownst to the callous ruling elite, the seeds of its eventual destruction had already been sown. The injustices and contradictions of the feudal system were becoming impossible to ignore, even as foreign powers were knocking at Japan's long-sealed doors. The time of the samurai was drawing to a close, the fury of the downtrodden peasantry no longer so easily contained. The Japanese people would endure yet more chaos, bloodshed and upheaval before emerging into the light of the modern era. But emerge they would, shaking off the stagnation of centuries, embracing the revolutionary ideals of progress, openness, and equality. In a few heady decades, the shoguns, daimyos, and samurai would fade into legend, swept away by the tide of history. But the long, nightmarish centuries in which they had held sway would not soon be forgotten. The spectre of those dark times lingered, a cautionary reminder of a feudal past defined by cruelty, oppression, and entrenched inequality. A time when the accident of birth fixed one's fate, when the strong relished their dominion over the weak, when the fruits of the many were devoured by an armored few. In the fading evening light, an old farmer straightens up from his work and surveys the emerald patchwork of rice paddies stretching to the horizon. He knows this life of endless toil all too well, feels its toll deep in his bones. But he also knows this is a different age, that his children and grandchildren will have opportunities scarcely imaginable to his ancestors. They will go to school, learn to read, perhaps even journey to the big city to make a new life. He has heard talk of rights, elections, a constitution to protect the common man. These are still new and fragile notions, but they stir something deep inside him. He dares to imagine a future in which his kind are no longer chattel, playthings of the powerful, but citizens, equal in dignity, valued beyond the mere work of their calloused hands. Of course, much hard work still lies ahead, with many obstacles yet to overcome. He knows his grandsons might well find themselves stooped over in these same paddies as he is now, weighed down by the weary rhythms of the old cycle. Change will not come quickly to this timeless landscape of lush fields, swaying pines and ancient hills. But as the last rays of sun dip below the peaks, the old man allows himself a moment of cautious hope. He straightens his creaking back and inhales deeply of the cooling air. His people have endured so much for so long, adapted to every wind of fate. Surely, slowly but inexorably, they will find their way to that brighter future, look back on the long darkness and marvel at how far they've come. But such grand transformations will unfold in their own good time. For now, the old farmer turns for home, ready to ease his aching frame into bed and welcome the oblivion of sleep. Tomorrow, he will rise and step once. Through all these tales of hardship and brutality, a picture emerges of a society where the accident of one's birth overwhelmingly determined the course of their life. The class you were born into was the class you died in, with precious little chance of rising above your station no matter how capable or industrious you might be. For the vast peasantry, life was an unrelenting struggle against hunger, toil, and the constant threat of violence from their samurai overlords. Most barely scraped by, surviving on millet, barley, and a few precious scraps of vegetables. Meat was a rare luxury. In lean years, which were all too common, many were reduced to eating grass and roots to fill their bellies as famines stalked the land. The peasants worked from sunup to sundown in the rice paddies and fields, their backs permanently stooped from the ceaseless labour. They lived in fear of displeasing their lords, knowing that any perceived insolence could bring a swift and brutal beating from the samurai enforcers. It was a life of few creature comforts and many hardships, with little to look forward to but more of the same. Even for the artisans and merchants, who enjoyed a slightly higher station, life was far from easy. Though some of the merchant class grew wealthy from trade, they still sat at the bottom of the social hierarchy, disdained by the samurai elite. Sumptuary laws kept them from flaunting their success, dictating the size of their houses and the fabrics they could wear. Stepping outside the boundaries of one's rank was harshly discouraged. The craftsmen and artisans, while skilled in their trades, likewise had little autonomy. They laboured under the rigid control of guilds that limited their production and pricing. Original designs were stifled in favour of time-tested traditional motifs. An independent spirit could bring censure and sanction from the guild masters. Perhaps worst off were the outcasts of society, the ETA and Heinin underclasses. These people were forced into degrading occupations and made to live in segregated settlements on the fringes of towns and cities. They were seen as subhuman, tainted by their association with death and waste. Treated as untouchables, they could be abused and even killed without consequence. For all outside the samurai class, advancement was nigh impossible. Society was a ladder with most rungs missing, the way upwards blocked by the Neo-Confucian doctrine that preached rigid hierarchies as the natural order of things. You were born into your role, you fulfilled your duties with obedience and humility, and you died with a little mark on the world. Even among the ruling samurai class, life was far from an idyll. The way of the warrior was romanticized as a life of honor and glory, but the reality was often short, brutal, and bleak. If you were fortunate, you served your daimyo lord faithfully and died of old age. But a shadow of violent death always loomed. Any misstep or defeat could demand the gory self-sacrifice of seppuku to absolve your shame. Most samurai prepared for this possibility, penning death poems to be read upon their bloody demise. The famed samurai warrior Toyotomi Hideyoshi exemplified the ruthless spirit of the age. Born a lowly peasant through sheer ability and unscrupulous politicking, he rose to become the most powerful man in Japan, ruling as regent in the late 1500s. He was known for his brutal policies, including the persecution of Christians and a series of invasions of Korea that left millions dead. Hideyoshi's megalomania knew no bounds. In one infamous episode, he ordered the ears of 30,000 slain Korean soldiers sent back to Japan, pickled in brine, to be entombed in a grisly mound as a war trophy. The great hero of unification had a vast cruel streak reflecting the harsh realities of the time. For all classes and castes of feudal Japanese society, life was often nasty, brutish, and short. War, famine, poverty, and oppression were inescapable facts of life for most. The code of Bushido and the refinements of art and culture sat in uneasy coexistence with a system that imposed a stark brutality on the populace. Even the highest lords lived under the constant spectre of shifting alliances, coups, and violent overthrow. Any perceived weakness could prove fatal in the cutthroat world of feudal politics. The price of power was eternal vigilance against usurpers and rivals. This state of affairs would continue for centuries until the feudal system finally began to buckle in the 1800s under the pressures of economic change, Western influence, and rising discontent among the lower classes. The shogun's hold on power would give way, and a new era would dawn with the Meiji Restoration in 1868. But for the generations that lived and died under the weight of feudal oppression, life was often a trial of endurance in the face of great adversity. The human spirit persisted, finding what joy it could amidst the hardships. But daily existence was a far cry from the romanticized image of the noble samurai and his loyal retainers. The reality was harsher, crueler, and far more stratified. It was a time of short lives and long sufferings for all too many. The feudal centuries cast a long shadow over Japanese history, a reminder of the darkness that can reside alongside the light in the human story. As we close this chapter, on the often brutal realities of life in feudal Japan, reflect for a moment on the resilience of those who endured such times. Theirs was a world almost unimaginably different from our own, yet they too knew love, hope, fear, and sorrow. In our modern comfort and security, it is easy to forget the trials of those who came before. But in remembering their harsh lot, we perhaps better appreciate the freedoms and opportunities we enjoy today. History, even at its darkest, has much to teach us about the progress of the human condition. The feudal era of Japan, for all its cruelties and inequities, sowed the seeds of what would grow into a strong, dynamic nation. The values of discipline, loyalty, aesthetics, and community forged in that time would shape and define Japanese culture for generations to come. A long road still lay ahead, but the first steps had been taken. And so, as the sun sinks low over the feudal horizon, we bid goodnight to this bygone age. May your dreams be gentler than the times we've spoken of, and your days brighter than those of ages past. If you found this tour through history engaging, your loyal guide would be most honored by a like and a subscribe. There are always more stories to tell. But for now, rest well, secure in the knowledge that the present, for all its troubles, remains a kinder time than the harsh centuries we've left behind. The past recedes, but its lessons linger on. And so, as the nobles of old retired to their castle keeps, we return to the keep of sleep, a little wiser, a little wearier, and glad of our place in a world moved on from such feudal days. Good night. As the sun set over the rugged hills, casting long shadows across the village below, the peasants returned from another bone-wearying day in the fields. Their faces were weathered and worn, etched with the hardships of their meagre existence. They moved slowly, their bodies hunched from years of back-breaking labor, their feet shuffling up the dirt paths to their humble homes. In one small hut, a flickering oil lamp illuminated the drawn face of a young mother as she stirred a pot of thin rice gruel over the cooking fire. Her infant son whimpered in a basket nearby, his belly distended from hunger. The woman's husband sat slumped against the wall, staring vacantly into the dancing flames, his calloused hands lying idle in his lap. The day's work had left him spent in both body and spirit. This was the nightly scene in countless peasant households across feudal Japan. Life was an unrelenting struggle for survival, with little respite or hope for a better future. From sunup to sundown, the peasants toiled in their lord's fields, scratching out a bare subsistence from the unforgiving earth. They were the lowest rung on the social ladder, the foundation upon which the entire feudal system rested, yet they reaped few of its rewards. Up to 90% of the population were peasants during the feudal era, bound to the land in a state of virtual servitude. Though not technically slaves, they were not free to leave their villages or change their lot in life. They were born into their position and died in it, their days an endless cycle of sowing, reaping, and laboring in service to their daimyo lords. The daimyo were the wealthy landowners who ruled over their peasants like petty kings. From lavish castles overlooking vast domains, they wielded total authority over their subjects' lives. The peasants worked the daimyo's land, paid him taxes in rice and other goods, and even fought in his armies when called upon. In return, they received the dubious privilege of eking out a marginal living for themselves from whatever scraps were left over. It was a precarious existence, forever at the mercy of forces beyond the peasants' control. A late frost, a summer drought, or a plague of locusts could spell disaster, destroying the crops and plunging the village into famine. With no surpluses or safety nets to fall back on, a bad harvest could mean starvation and death for the weakest and most vulnerable. Even in good times, peasant families teetered on the knife's edge of destitution. Most barely grew enough food to fill their own bellies, let alone pay the daimyo's taxes and still have something left to sell or trade. They subsisted on a monotonous diet of rice, vegetables, and the occasional bit of fish if they were lucky enough to live near the coast. Meat was a rare luxury, as were the colourful silk kimono worn by their samurai overlords. Rough homespun cotton was the fabric of the peasant class. Their homes were equally humble, small, dark huts of wood and mud with thatched roofs, often housing both human and animal occupants. A typical peasant family lived, ate, and slept together in a single smoky room, with only a few worn futons laid out on the dirt floor for furniture. Privacy was non-existent, and sanitation primitive at best. It was a breeding ground for disease, especially in crowded villages where sewage flowed in open gutters. Fire was an ever-present danger in these cramped, ramshackle settlements. With homes built of flimsy wood, paper, and straw, an errant spark or tipped-over candle could quickly engulf a whole village in flames. The great city of Edo, which would later become Tokyo, burned to the ground multiple times over the centuries, leaving tens of thousands homeless in the ashes. If they were fortunate enough to escape calamities of weather, pestilence, and fire, the peasants still had to contend with the depredations of their social betters. Samurai were notorious for their casual cruelty to those beneath them, seeing the peasantry as little more than human chattel to be used and abused at will. Tales abounded of villagers being forced to kneel in the mud for hours or even days as punishment for minor transgressions, of farmers being beaten senseless for perceived disrespect, of women being violated by bored samurai without consequence. The constant threat of violence was a fact of life for the peasantry, as rivalries between daimyo frequently erupted into open warfare across the countryside. When armies clashed, it was the villagers who suffered most, their homes and fields becoming a battleground for the armoured samurai on horseback. Crops were trampled, livestock slaughtered, and whole villages put to the torch as the warring factions laid waste to each other's domains. Thievery and brigandry were rampant during these periods of unrest, as desperate peasants turned to raiding and plundering to survive. Bands of ronin, masterless samurai dispossessed by the chaos, roved the land, extorting food and valuables from the cowed populace. Even in times of relative peace, highwaymen lurked in the mountain passes and forests, preying on travellers and merchant caravans. With the samurai busy fighting each other, there was often little protection for the common folk. For all the miseries and injustices they endured, the peasants had virtually no recourse or path to a better life. The feudal hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving, with each person's role and rank ordained from birth. A peasant could not aspire to become a samurai, no matter his talents or ambitions. Even wealth offered no escape, as the rich merchant class, despite their money, still ranked beneath the poorest samurai in the social order. This inflexible caste system bred a deep sense of fatalism and resignation among the peasantry. They knew that their lot was to endure, to bear their hardships with stoic acceptance, and to find what small comforts they could in family, community, and faith. Buddhism, with its emphasis on the impermanence of worldly things and the release from suffering through enlightenment, held particular appeal for the downtrodden masses. But not all accepted their fate quietly. Pushed beyond endurance, peasants sometimes rose up in desperate, doomed rebellions against their overlords. These uprisings were usually local affairs, sparked by some especially egregious abuse or hardship, and quickly crushed by the superior arms and organization of the samurai. One of the largest and most famous peasant revolts was the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637–38. An estimated 27,000 Christian peasants on the Shimabara Peninsula, chafing under the brutal persecution of their faith, banded together to overthrow their daimyo and establish a kind of peasant utopia. The rebellion began with the peasants seizing several fortified castles, a stunning feat that testified to their zeal and their numbers. The Tokugawa shogunate, which had banned Christianity as a subversive foreign influence, sent a massive army to quell the uprising. The peasants, many armed only with farming tools, held out against the siege for months before being overwhelmed. In the end, the rebel stronghold was stormed, and some 37,000 insurgents and sympathizers were massacred, men, women and children put to the sword. It was a tragic but telling example of the vast power imbalance between rulers and ruled in feudal Japan. The Shimabara Rebellion would be the last major armed resistance by the peasantry, a futile gesture of defiance against a system that offered them no real hope or justice. In the centuries that followed, Japan would gradually transition from feudalism to a more modern, centralized state. But change came slowly and unevenly, with the rural peasantry often the last to see real improvements in their condition. Even as cities like Edo and Osaka grew and prospered, life in the villages remained mired in poverty and toil for generations. It was not until the Meiji Restoration of 1868, which ended the shogunate and restored the emperor to power, that the feudal system was finally abolished and the way was paved for a new, more egalitarian social order. Land reforms, industrialization, and the growth of public education would slowly lift the peasantry out of the depths of immiseration, though rural poverty remained widespread well into the 20th century. Looking back from the vantage of the present day, it can be hard to fathom the sheer scale of human suffering that took place during Japan's long feudal era. For hundreds of years, the great mass of the population endured a bleak existence of grinding poverty, ceaseless drudgery, and the constant peril of famine, disease, and violence. It was a time when a person's life was circumscribed from birth, their fate fixed by the accident of their social class. Yet it was also an era that gave rise to cultural traditions that would define Japanese identity for generations. The samurai code of Bushido, the way of tea, the austerities of Zen. It was an age of strife and cruelty, but also of great art, poetry, and spiritual yearning. Perhaps more than anything, it was a time of endurance, when the Japanese people, through sheer tenacity and resilience, weathered the long centuries of hardship to forge the foundations of the modern nation we know today. As we reflect on this history from the comfort and security of our own age, it is a humbling reminder of the progress we've made and the struggles of those who came before us. It is a testament to the indomitable spirit of the human race, which has somehow managed to endure and even thrive through the darkest of times. And it is a challenge to us to use our own relative good fortune to build a world of greater justice, compassion, and opportunity for all. And with that quiet reflection, we come to the end of our journey through the brutal realities of life in feudal Japan. I hope this exploration of history has brought you a deeper understanding of the past, even as it lulled you gently into the embrace of sleep. If you enjoyed drifting off to the sound of these tales, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more soothing bedtime stories steeped in the fascinating annals of human civilization. Thank you for joining me on this voyage through the centuries, and may your dreams be filled with the wonders of ages past. Good night. Life under the strictly regimented feudal system was a constant struggle for survival, especially for the lower classes who made up the vast majority. Not only were they perpetually on the brink of starvation, but they faced a justice system that was swift and harsh in meting out punishments. Even minor crimes could result in severe penalties. Take the story of a poor farmer we'll call Haruki. In 1720, a string of poor harvests had left him and his family desperate and hungry. One morning, he was caught stealing a bag of rice from his daimyo's storehouse. Haruki was quickly arrested and hauled before the local magistrate. There was no real trial, just a swift summary of his obvious guilt. The sentence was read out. For the crime of stealing from his lord, Haruki would be crucified. Crucifixion was a fairly common form of execution in feudal Japan, often used for serious crimes against the state or one's superiors. The condemned would be tied or nailed to a cross and left to die a slow, agonizing death from exposure and asphyxiation, serving as a grim public warning to others. Haruki spent his final hours tied to a rough wooden cross on the outskirts of his village. As he hung there painfully, slowly dying, he served as a potent reminder of the draconian price to pay for violating the social order, no matter how desperate one's circumstances. His wife and children would now be destitute, likely forced to sell themselves into servitude to avoid the same fate. This was the unrelenting harshness of feudal justice, swift, brutal, and merciless, aimed at keeping the masses cowed and obedient through terror. There was no concern for circumstance or mercy for the unfortunate. The system existed to preserve the rigid hierarchy, not serve real justice. Even for those not facing the executioner's blade or the crucifixion's stake, the constant threat of draconian punishment kept people trapped in their oppressive roles. A samurai who failed in his duties, a peasant who fell behind on his taxes, a woman who displeased her husband, all could face physical punishment, imprisonment, exile, or worse under the feudal laws. The result was a society of stifling conformity, where stepping out of line even a little could spell one's doom. This atmosphere of harshness and fear even permeated the arts of the time. The great haiku poet Matsuo Basho, who lived from 1644 to 1694, often reflected on the themes of life's transience and the ever-present spectre of death in feudal Japan. One of his most famous works goes, "Summer grasses, all that remains, of warriors' dreams." In just a few simple words, Basho captures the melancholy truth of his era, that even the mightiest samurai were ultimately as ephemeral as summer grass, their glories fleeting and forgotten in death. The poem is a poignant reminder of the relentless brutality of the age, where death was always close and life was all too often nasty, painful, and short. As the Tokugawa period dragged on, the rigidity and oppressiveness of the feudal system began to strain under its own weight. The ruling shogunate increasingly struggled to maintain centralized control over the fracturing domains. Samurai found it harder to justify their privileged status in an era of extended peace. Merchants chafed at the restrictions placed on them even as their wealth and influence grew. Peasants, driven past the point of endurance by famines and excessive taxation, launched several major rebellions. The old order was slowly crumbling, but it would take a seismic shock from the outside world to finally topple it. That shock came in 1853, when American Commodore Matthew Perry steamed into Edo Bay with his fleet of modern warships, forcing an end to Japan's centuries of self-imposed isolation. This sudden confrontation with the industrial West triggered a crisis and a series of internal conflicts that ultimately led to the fall of the shogunate in 1868 and the birth of a modernizing Japanese state. The feudal age of Japan was coming to a close after centuries of entrenched brutality. The new Meiji era would bring wrenching changes and upheavals as the nation raced to catch up with the world. But it would also open the door for new ideas, technologies, and opportunities that had been stifled under the stagnant and oppressive rule of the shoguns and daimyo. A rigid and often ruthless social order was giving way, slowly, fitfully, and painfully, to a more dynamic modern society. Looking back, it's hard to grasp the sheer scale of the suffering and loss that took place during Japan's long feudal centuries. The abject misery of the peasants, the stifling restrictions placed on women, the cruelty of the justice system, the constant threat of famine and warfare, all combined to make life unrelentingly harsh for the vast majority. Yet even in these brutal conditions, the Japanese people managed to create art of haunting beauty, poetry of deep human feeling, and a rich culture that endures to this day. Perhaps there is an odd comfort to the thought that our own daily struggles and anxieties, however daunting they may seem, are fleeting things in the grand sweep of history. That even the mighty shoguns and samurai warlords who once held the power of life and death over millions are now long dead and mostly forgotten, no more permanent than the summer grass. And yet their stories live on, and there is value in learning about and remembering them. In understanding the past, we can better grasp the present and gain a little wisdom for the future. We can appreciate how far we've come in terms of justice, equality, and peace, even as we grapple with the challenges we still face. So as we close this chapter on the dark annals of feudal Japan, take a moment to reflect on the resilience of the human spirit across the centuries, to pay respect to the nameless millions who endured, struggled, and perished in those harsh times, and to appreciate all the small daily blessings of our modern lives, from a soft bed to sleep in, and a safe home to wake up in, to the basic dignities and freedoms so many feudal Japanese were denied. If you enjoyed this tour through the often tragic but always fascinating history of feudal Japan, consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the rich, strange, and surprising tapestry of the human past. We'll be here, bringing you more immersive journeys through the ages, one story at a time. Until next time, thanks for watching, and sweet dreams. As we've seen, life for the average person in feudal Japan was defined by backbreaking labor, rigid social roles, and a constant vulnerability to the whims of the powerful. The fictional but representative stories we've explored paint a vivid picture of the quiet desperation and intense hardship that permeated feudal society. While peasant families like the one we met earlier toiled endlessly just to survive, even relatively privileged women of the samurai class lived stifling, subservient lives. Matsushimaura's tale illustrates how little autonomy and fulfillment was available to women regardless of rank. Expected to master refined arts and graces but little else, a proper lady's world rarely extended beyond the confines of the family home. At the same time, samurai men were indoctrinated from birth in the brutal code of Bushido, which demanded utmost loyalty and a willingness to die at any moment. Seppuku, or ritual suicide by disembowelment, loomed as a constant prospect should a warrior fail, transgress, or fall out of favor. The gory fate of the disgraced samurai lieutenant we heard about vividly demonstrates the extremes required to retain honor in this martial culture. In many ways, the conformist values of Neo-Confucianism acted as an invisible prison, trapping people in prescribed identities and squashing their individuality. For those at the very bottom of the hierarchy, like the ETA outcast and his family, it made for a crushingly lonely and limited existence, forever separated from mainstream society. Even the love between his sister and her peasant paramour was harshly forbidden, as human feelings took a backseat to unyielding social mores. The growing merchant class, while slowly gaining economic influence, still faced a hard ceiling in social status. Families like the Tanakas poured endless hours into their businesses, paying onerous taxes and bribes, but were still considered low class, that they had to hide their illegal Christian faith or risk brutal persecution speaks to the strict limits on freedom of conscience. Similarly, entertainers like Hana the geisha lived in gilded cages, their lives devoted to the refined arts and pleasing men, but sharply circumscribed in behavior and appearance. To violate the strict codes of dress and conduct was to invite physical punishment and confinement, driving many to despair and self-destructive habits. The harsh justice system, defined by torture, corporal punishment, and a lack of due process, helped keep people in line through terror and example making. The sad fate of the petty thief, so broken by repeated floggings then executed for his desperation, illustrates the inhumanity of a legal code heavy on cruelty and light on mercy and rehabilitation. Looming over it all was the spectre of pervasive poverty, which left most of the population destitute and beholden to their feudal masters. While peasant uprisings, like the one we heard about, occasionally shook the foundations, they were always brutally suppressed in the end, the participants tortured and killed as warnings to others. In closing, feudal Japanese society was in many ways a beautiful and artistically vibrant one, responsible for exquisite material culture and timeless artistic traditions. But it was also an exceedingly strict and hierarchical world, where the majority laboured in misery to support a small elite in relative comfort at the top. The abiding legacy is one of a system that caused incalculable human suffering through its institutionalised oppression and entrenched inequality. The plight of the commoners, outcasts and peasants we've met here was sadly all too common, their stories of quiet anguish now lost to time. And while later chapters of Japanese history would hopefully chart a freer, more equitable course, we are left to reflect on the darkness endured by so many during the feudal centuries. Life may often have felt hopeless for those on the bottom rungs of this rigid system. But in a sense, their sacrifices paved the way for a better future. By living through and bearing witness to such a harsh, uncompromising world, they have gifted us hard but invaluable lessons about the human costs of unchecked power and inflexible social hierarchy. And with that somber food for thought, we'll draw our exploration of this tumultuous historical chapter to a close. I hope this look into feudal Japan's often brutal realities has been an illuminating and thought-provoking one, even as it lulls you into restful slumber. If you've enjoyed this journey through Japan's feudal past, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel for more immersive bedtime tales from history. And as always, may your dreams be sweeter than the times you've just vicariously lived through. With that, I wish you a tranquil night and a peaceful sleep. Until next time, good night. After centuries of strict codes, rigid hierarchy, and institutionalized inequality, the feudal system that had long held Japan in its iron grip finally began to crack and fracture in the 19th century. The seeds of its demise had been planted long before in the hearts of those who toiled under its yoke, dreaming of a better life. The peasants, who had long been the backbone of the nation, powering the economy with their backbreaking labour while reaping few rewards, grew increasingly resentful of the societal bonds that held them down. Though revolts like the one brutally crushed in the 1780s had been quickly suppressed, the spirit of discontent could not be quelled so easily. It simmered beneath the surface, biding its time. The samurai class, too, faced an existential threat as the centuries wore on. These fierce warriors, whose very identity was tied to their military might and code of honor, found their way of life becoming obsolete in an era of increasing peace and stability. Many samurai fell on hard times, becoming masterless ronin as the need for their martial skills diminished. The same power structure that had once elevated them now left them adrift. Even the daimyo, the great lords who ruled over feudal domains, were not immune to the winds of change. Weakened by centuries of infighting, intrigue, and overtaxation of their subjects, many found their power and influence waning. The political and economic landscape was shifting beneath their feet, and try as they might to cling to the old ways, the tide of history could not be held back forever. But perhaps the greatest catalyst for change came from beyond Japan's shores. For centuries, the nation had studiously isolated itself from the outside world, maintaining only limited contact through a few strictly controlled ports. This policy of sakoku, or closed country, had allowed Japan to develop its unique culture and society in relative seclusion. But by the mid-19th century, the outside world could no longer be ignored. The arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry and his fleet of American ships in 1853 sent shockwaves through Japanese society. Perry's demand that Japan open its ports to foreign trade, backed by the threat of his powerful cannons, made it starkly clear that the days of isolation were over. Japan found itself suddenly and uncomfortably thrust onto the global stage, forced to confront a rapidly modernizing world. The years that followed saw Japan undergo a remarkable transformation, as the old feudal order crumbled away and a new, modern nation began to take shape. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 marked the formal end of the shogunate and the restoration of the emperor to nominal supreme power. But more than that, it signaled a profound shift in Japanese society as the nation set out to modernize and catch up to the Western powers. The samurai class was officially abolished, their status and privileges revoked. Many former warriors struggled to adapt to this new reality, their swords replaced by pens as they took on roles as bureaucrats and administrators in the new government. Others turned to new professions, becoming teachers, doctors, or businessmen. It was a difficult transition for many, but one that reflected the changing times. The lives of ordinary people, too, began to change in profound ways. The strict social hierarchy that had once kept everyone in their place began to break down, as new ideas about individual rights and freedoms took hold. Education became more widely available, and with it came increased social mobility. Peasants were no longer tied to the land, and many flocked to the cities in search of new opportunities. But change did not come easily or without conflict. The rapid pace of modernization and the influx of foreign influence sparked backlash from some quarters, as conservatives sought to preserve traditional ways of life. The early years of the Meiji era saw numerous rebellions and uprisings, as different factions vied for power and influence in the new order. But through it all, Japan continued to push forward, determined to forge a new path. As the 19th century drew to a close, the nation that had once been ruled by a rigid feudal system had transformed itself into a modern industrial power, complete with a new constitution, a national army, and a rapidly expanding economy. It was a remarkable feat, one that had been achieved through the efforts and sacrifices of countless individuals, from the lowliest peasant to the most powerful lord. But even as Japan celebrated its new status as a major player on the world stage, the scars of the feudal era lingered on. The legacy of those centuries of brutal oppression and inequality could not be erased overnight, and the nation would continue to grapple with the ghosts of its past as it charted its course into the future. For the common people, who had endured so much hardship and suffering under the feudal system, the promise of a brighter tomorrow was a beacon of hope. They had known the depths of despair, the gnawing hunger of famine, the terror of warfare, and the crushing weight of servitude. They had seen their loved ones brutalized and broken, their hopes and dreams shattered on the unyielding anvil of feudal oppression. But through it all, they had persevered, clinging to the stubborn belief that a better life was possible. And now, at last, it seemed that their long nightmare was finally coming to an end. The road ahead would not be easy, and there would be many more challenges and setbacks to come. But for the first time in centuries, the people of Japan could dare to dream of a future that was not defined by the accidents of birth and the whims of their betters. As we look back on this pivotal moment in Japanese history, it is impossible not to be struck by the incredible resilience and determination of the human spirit. Through centuries of darkness and despair, the people of Japan had endured, their hearts beating out a stubborn rhythm of hope and defiance. And when the time came to seize their destiny, they did so with a fierce and unwavering resolve. It is a lesson that echoes through the ages, a reminder that even in the face of the most daunting odds, the human will to survive and thrive is a force to be reckoned with. and it is a testament to the enduring power of the dreams and aspirations that burn within us all, no matter how humble our origins or how great the obstacles in our path. So let us remember the struggles and sacrifices of those who came before, the countless lives that were spent in the long and bitter struggle for freedom and dignity, and let us honor their memory by striving always to build a world where every person, no matter their station or circumstance, has the chance to live a life of purpose and meaning. As we come to the end of our journey through the dark and turbulent world of feudal Japan, I invite you to take a moment to reflect on all that we have witnessed together. The tales of suffering and sorrow, of courage and resilience, of hope and transformation. These are the stories that make us human, the threads that bind us together across the centuries. And as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you will dream of a different time and place. A world where the chains of oppression have been cast off and the human spirit is free to soar. A world where every person has the chance to write their own story, to shape their own destiny. A world where the brutality of the past has given way to the promise of a brighter tomorrow. May your dreams be filled with hope and wonder, and may you wake to a world where the lessons of history have been learned and the promise of a better future is within our grasp. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the annals of Japan's feudal era. And if you've found these tales of history and humanity as captivating as I have, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel so that we may embark on many more adventures together through the fascinating and endlessly intriguing twists and turns of our shared past. Until then, I wish you a restful sleep and a bright tomorrow. Good night. As we've seen, life for the common people during feudal Japan was marked by unrelenting hardship, oppression, and a rigid social order that offered little hope of a better future. The vast majority toiled in grinding poverty, forever at the mercy of the whims of their local lords and samurai. Even for those slightly higher up the social ladder, like skilled artisans and merchants, life was far from easy. The Tanaka family, who we met earlier, ran a modest kimono shop in the bustling capital of Edo. While their business afforded them a somewhat more comfortable existence than the peasants in the fields, they still faced many daily struggles and restrictions. Long work hours were a fact of life for the Tanakas. From sunrise well into the night, the entire family was engaged in the intricate process of making kimonos, from cutting the fine silks, to stitching the garments, to dyeing them in vivid colors and patterns. The shop was their whole world, and they rarely had a moment of rest. On top of their unceasing labors, the family had to contend with an onerous tax burden that ate into their modest profits. The local daimyo expected his cut, as did the various officials and inspectors who could make life difficult if not appropriately paid off. Bribes and kickbacks were just a part of doing business. But what really kept the Tanakas up at night was the fear that their secret Christian faith would be discovered. Christianity had been outlawed for over a century, with the Tokugawa shogunate brutally suppressing the foreign religion and forcing its adherents underground. Discovery meant arrest, torture, and even execution. So the family kept their beliefs carefully hidden, not even daring to keep Christian symbols or texts in the house lest they be found. They prayed in silence and attended covert meetings with other believers under the guise of social calls. It was a heavy emotional burden, always being on guard and never feeling they could truly be themselves. This was one of the great cruelties of the feudal system, that even the human spirit and freedom of conscience was not spared the weight of oppression. The Tanaka's story illustrates how even those who found a measure of economic security could not escape the authoritarian social order that demanded strict obedience and conformity. We see this again in the experience of Hana, a young geisha who found herself chafing under the restrictive codes that governed her every move. As an entertainer, Hana's role was to be pleasing and alluring to her male clients, but never to engage in actual romance or intimacy. When she slipped up and returned a client's amorous advances, she was beaten harshly as punishment. Even Hana's choice of dress was not her own. The vivid colors and luxurious fabrics of a geisha's kimono were all part of the fantasy illusion she was meant to create. But certain shades were forbidden to her, reserved only for her higher-ranking clientele. When Hana dared to wear a purple kimono that caught her fancy, she was placed under house arrest for her transgression. Hana coped with the crushing pressure and lack of agency the only way she could, by drowning her sorrows in sake. But even this small act of rebellion had to be carefully concealed. A geisha was supposed to be poised and in control at all times, not a slave to drink and vice. So Hana suffered her private misery in silence. The strict moral codes of the day made life a joyless trial for many. Public displays of affection were considered shameful, as were frivolous pastimes like dancing and theatre. Laughter and leisure were luxuries reserved only for the samurai class, and even then to be indulged in moderation only. Austerity and restraint were the order of the day. These rigid standards were enforced through a system of justice that was swift and severe. The accused were presumed guilty until proven innocent, if given a chance to prove their innocence at all. Torture was commonly used to extract confessions, often leading to false admissions of guilt. Punishments were brutal and designed to inflict maximum suffering. Flogging with wooden paddles or iron rods was a common sentence for minor offences, leaving the victim bloody and broken. Exile was another fate that awaited those who ran afoul of the law, cast out from their homes and families to fend for themselves in the wilderness. But perhaps the cruelest cut was reserved for those at the very bottom of the social order, the ETA class of outcasts. Considered subhuman and unclean, the ETA were shunned by mainstream society and confined to their own squalid ghettos on the margins of towns. We met one Eta man who was born into this life of exclusion and stigma. Though he and his family worked essential jobs like butchering animals and tanning hides, they were still looked upon with revulsion and disdain. They were forbidden from marrying outside their class, or even wearing the same clothing as commoners. When his sister dared to fall in love with a peasant boy, their innocent romance was met with swift and harsh condemnation. Such a breach of the social order could not be tolerated. They were both threatened with death if they did not break off their relationship at once. For the ETA and other outcasts, life was a constant reminder of their degraded status. They were not even afforded the basic dignity of being regarded as fully human. Their oppression was total and inescapable, enshrined in a rigid caste system that allowed for no social mobility. This was the overarching tragedy of feudal Japan, that the vast majority of people were trapped in a suffocating hierarchy that determined their lot in life from birth to death. It was a system built on exploitation, cruelty, and the ruthless suppression of the human spirit. Even the arts and culture of the age reflected these bleak realities. The literary forms popular among the elites were often dark and cynical, dwelling on the fleeting nature of life and the inevitability of suffering. The great haiku masters wrote of existential despair, while the playwrights staged dramas full of betrayal, vengeance, and death. There was little room for hope or optimism in this grim worldview. The people of feudal Japan endured lives of unrelenting hardship simply because they had no other choice. They were born into a system that demanded their submission and offered no path to a better future. But even in the darkest of times, the human spirit finds ways to resist. We see this in the small acts of defiance and self-assertion carried out by people like Hana and the star-crossed Ita lovers. They may have been ground down by the weight of their society, but they still found tiny ways to assert their humanity. And in the larger scope of history, we know that change was coming. The feudal system, for all its seeming permanence, was not to last. The seeds of its undoing were already being sown in the form of economic shifts, social upheaval, and new ways of thinking that would eventually break the centuries-old order. But those are stories for another day. For now, we leave feudal Japan as we found it, a harsh and unforgiving world where life was brief and often brutal. It is a sobering reminder of the cruelty that humans can inflict upon one another when avarice and authoritarianism are the guiding forces of society. And yet, it is also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, that people could endure such bleak conditions and still find small ways to love, to laugh, to create art and find meaning. This is the inextinguishable spark of hope that carries us through even the darkest of times. As this final chapter comes to a close, we invite you to take a moment to reflect on the incredible hardships and challenges that the people of feudal Japan faced every day. Their struggles may be distant from us in time and place, but their experiences speak to universal truths about the human condition and the indomitable will to survive and resist in the face of oppression. If you found these stories and insights compelling, we encourage you to like and subscribe to our channel. There are so many more fascinating journeys into the past waiting to be explored, and we would be honored to have you along for the ride. Until next time, this is your guide through the annals of history, wishing you a restful night's sleep filled with dreams of a brighter tomorrow. For though the feudal era may have been a time of great darkness, we can take solace in knowing that the dawn of a new age was just over the horizon. So let us all strive in our own lives to learn from the mistakes of the past, to fight for justice and equality, and to cherish the freedoms that were so cruelly denied to our forebearers. If we can do that, then perhaps their suffering will not have been in vain, and we can begin to build a world where the light of human dignity shines for all. Good night, and thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows of history. May your dreams be filled with the hopes of a better, more just world. As we've seen, the life of a peasant in feudal Japan was one of unrelenting hardship and toil. From sunup to sundown, they labored in the fields, eking out a meager existence at the mercy of their local lords. Even the slightest misstep or misfortune could spell catastrophe. Take the story of young Jiro, a fictional but all too representative farmer's son in the early 1700s. From the time he could walk, Jiro was put to work, feeding livestock, hauling water, repairing tools. Playtime was a rare luxury. His childhood was spent in service to the unending demands of the rice paddies. As Jiro grew into adolescence, his responsibilities only increased. With his aging father struggling to keep up, more and more fell on Jiro's shoulders. Long days bent over in the muddy fields left him with an aching back and weathered hands that belied his youth. A quarter of the rice they grew went to the daimyo as tax, leaving precious little to fill their bellies. When Jiro was 16, his life took a dramatic turn. A minor dispute with a higher-ranking villager ended with Jiro knocked to the ground, his face pushed into the dirt. Enraged and humiliated, Jiro foolishly challenged the man to a fight. Unarmed combat between peasants was harshly forbidden. When word reached the magistrate, the punishment was swift and severe. Jiro was dragged before the village, stripped to the waist and tied to a post. In front of his family and neighbors, he was flogged 20 times with a wooden paddle, the crack of each blow ringing out across the hill. By the end, Jiro was a bloody, broken mess, the skin flayed from his back. He hung limply in his bonds, barely conscious. For his insolence, Jiro was cast out from the village, exiled to wander as a beggar. If he returned, he'd be executed on the spot. His tearful parents pleaded for mercy, but the law was unyielding. At 16, Jiro was now rootless and alone, just another lost soul cut adrift in a callous feudal system. His pain and despair were like an unheard scream in the night. Jiro's tale may be invented, but it echoes the reality faced by countless peasants of his time. In a rigidly hierarchical society with no social mobility, most were condemned to a life of poverty and servitude from birth. Stepped on by those above them, they had no recourse, no path to a better tomorrow. This sense of hopeless stagnation eroded the human spirit. Worn down by drudgery and deprivation, many sank into despair and nihilism. Suicide and infanticide rates were high, especially in times of famine. Heavy drinking and gambling offered fleeting escapes. Animosity toward the ruling classes sometimes boiled over into riots and uprisings, but these were always violently crushed. Some sought solace in religion, praying to Shinto spirits and Buddhist bodhisattvas for divine intercession. But in a world where bad karma was believed to carry over from past lives, many saw their wretched state as an unalterable spiritual destiny. They were born into suffering because they deserved to suffer, also the dominant Neo-Confucian doctrine claimed. Opportunities for genuine joy and fulfillment were few. Marriages were arranged for practicality, not love. Festivities and holidays offered brief respites, but the spectre of hunger and hardship always loomed. For farming families, a daughter was often seen as just another mouth to feed. Many were sold into servitude at a young age or trafficked into prostitution. This was the bleak reality hidden beneath the silk screens and cherry blossoms, the immense human suffering on which the elegant facade of feudal society was built. While samurai warlords waged their endless power struggles, the peasantry bore the bloody cost, their cries muffled beneath the clatter of armor and sword. But oppression can only be sustained for so long before the center starts to crack. By the mid-1800s, the feudal system was straining under its own weight. The samurai class had grown bloated and unruly, bleeding the daimyo's coffers dry. Merchants were gaining economic clout, upsetting the traditional order. 2 centuries of enforced isolation had left Japan vulnerable and backward compared to industrializing Western powers. When outside pressure finally forced Japan's ports open in 1853, the shockwaves reverberated throughout society. The influx of foreign ideas and technology undermined old certainties. Calls for change grew louder, even as the Tokugawa shogunate scrambled to reassert control. The ensuing turmoil would spell the beginning of the end for feudal rule. In 1868, imperial power was dramatically restored under Emperor Meiji, and Japan began its dizzying ascent into the modern age. The feudal caste system was officially abolished, though social inequalities would linger for generations. Rapid industrialization and militarization catapulted Japan onto the world stage as an emerging colonial power. But even as the trappings of feudal life faded into history, its deep imprint on the Japanese psyche endured. The Neo-Confucian ideals of filial piety, social harmony, and unquestioning loyalty to authority remained deeply ingrained, if less overt. The concept of knowing one's place still exerted a powerful pull on the cultural imagination. In many ways, the story of feudal Japan is one of extraordinary resilience in the face of relentless adversity. Through centuries of war, famine, and oppression, Japan's people found ways to preserve their unique culture and identity. From the exquisite art of the floating world to the austere rituals of the tea ceremony, beauty and meaning were painstakingly wrought from the darkest of circumstances. But we shouldn't romanticize this brutal chapter of history. The human cost was incalculable, and the scars run deep. Feudal Japan was a society built on a foundation of exploitation and suffering, where the strong ruled with impunity, and the weak endured what they must. It's a solemn reminder of the cruelty we're capable of inflicting on one another. So, let us remember the forgotten lives ground beneath the wheel of feudal oppression, the lowly peasants, the shunned outcasts, the powerless women and children. May we bring their untold stories into the light and honor their quiet strength and dignity in the face of a cold and unforgiving world. And as we drift off to sleep, let us be grateful for how far we've come, even as we acknowledge the lingering shadows of the past. The road to a truly just and equitable society is long and winding, and we still have miles to go. But by learning from the hard lessons of history, we can keep striving for a future where everyone has the chance to live with freedom and dignity. This brings us to the end of our journey through the dark annals of feudal Japan. If you found this exploration meaningful, consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. We'll be here, keeping the flame of remembrance alive, one story at a time. Until next time, thanks for watching, and sweet dreams. Life for the artisans and merchants of feudal Japan may have offered a small respite from the backbreaking drudgery of the peasant class, but it was still a far cry from comfort or security. These urban dwellers, while privileged enough to pursue a skilled trade or engage in commerce, were still very much at the mercy of the rigid hierarchy that permeated every aspect of feudal society. Artisans like blacksmiths, weavers, potters, and woodworkers formed the backbone of the urban economy, crafting the essential goods that kept the machine of feudal life running. From the samurai's swords to the peasants' tools, the artisans' skilled hands were behind it all. But this did not translate into high status or a life of plenty. No, the artisan was still bound by the strict codes and regulations of the guild system. The guilds were essentially a way for the ruling classes to keep tight control over production and limit any chances of social mobility. Each artisan was required to belong to the appropriate guild for their trade, following their rules on everything from pricing to production methods to the number of apprentices one could take on. It was a far cry from a free market, more like a cage of conformity that kept the artisan firmly in his place. An artisan couldn't simply strike out on his own or innovate beyond what the guild allowed. Everything had to be done by the book, stifling any budding entrepreneurial spirit. The guilds also kept a watchful eye out for any foreign techniques or technologies that might disrupt the profitable status quo. In many ways, the guilds acted as yet another layer of control, another way for the samurai elites to maintain their stranglehold on power and wealth. This isn't to say the artisans lived in abject poverty like the peasantry. They typically enjoyed a standard of living a notch or two above the subsistence farmers, with their homes and workshops clustered in the cities and towns. But they were by no means living lavishly. A typical artisan worked brutally long hours, often from sunrise to sunset, 6 or even 7 days a week. The whole family would pitch in, with children learning the trade from a young age. Apprenticeships could last a decade or more, with the aspiring artisan essentially serving as cheap labor until they proved their mastery. And even then, they'd still be subject to the suffocating rules and restrictions of the guild. It was a life of endless toil, with little room for rest or leisure. The merchants, too, occupied a precarious position in feudal Japan's social order. On the one hand, their skills in buying, selling, and transporting goods were essential to keeping the economy running smoothly. And as time went on, some merchants were able to amass sizable fortunes, rivaling even the wealthiest samurai in terms of sheer riches. But in the eyes of the Neo-Confucian worldview that dominated feudal Japan, merchants were still considered the lowest of the low on the social totem pole. According to this philosophy, merchants didn't actually produce anything of value. They simply moved goods around and profited off the labor of others. In a society that placed a high value on duty, loyalty, and knowing one's place, the merchant's self-interested dealings were seen as distasteful at best, immoral at worst. This left the merchant class in a sort of social limbo. They could never hope to rise into the ranks of the samurai, no matter how much wealth they accumulated. They were perpetually looked down upon as greedy and untrustworthy. At the same time, the samurai elites were more than happy to do business with successful merchants. often relying on them for loans to fund their lavish lifestyles or military campaigns. It was a strange dichotomy. The merchants were scorned as social inferiors, yet increasingly indispensable to the functioning of the feudal economy. Some of the most prosperous merchant families even found ways to translate their economic clout into a degree of political influence, albeit indirectly. They might marry their daughters off to minor samurai to secure a tenuous connection to the upper crust, or use their wealth to curry favor and protection from powerful lords. But no amount of money could fully insulate the merchants from the hardships and restrictions of feudal life. They too were subject to the rigid codes and regulations that governed every aspect of society. Sumptuary laws dictated the kinds of clothes they could wear, the food they could eat, even the sort of houses they could live in, all based on their officially designated social rank. And like the artisans, the merchants worked grueling hours, with the whole family pitching in to keep the business afloat. The markets and streets of feudal Japan's cities buzzed with commercial activity from dawn to dusk, with merchants hawking their wares, striking deals, and frantically scrambling to get ahead. For many, it was a life consumed by the relentless pursuit of profit, with little room for anything else. But as tough as the merchants had it, there was always someone lower on the social ladder. The merchants may have been the bottom rung of the feudal hierarchy, but there was one group that was considered so defiled they weren't even part of the ladder at all: the ETA. The ETA were the outcasts of outcasts, the untouchables of feudal Japanese society. This wasn't simply a matter of being poor or low status. The ETA were considered inherently polluted, tainted by their association with death and animal slaughter. They were the tanners, the butchers, the executioners, the gravediggers. Anyone whose profession involved the taking of life or the handling of dead bodies. In the Neo-Confucian worldview, this contact with death rendered the Ite permanently unclean, almost subhuman. They were forced to live in segregated hamlets on the outskirts of towns and villages, forbidden from mingling with the rest of society. When they did venture beyond their quarters, they had to wear distinctive clothing, a kind of badge of dishonor, to warn others of their untouchable status. The depths of discrimination against the ETA were truly staggering. They were barred from marrying anyone of a higher social class, not that many would even consider such a taboo union. They were forbidden from entering certain temples and shrines, lest their mere presence sully the sacred grounds. Even their shadows were considered polluting. An eater had to bow their head and hunker down when passing a commoner on the road, lest their tainted silhouette fall across the path. It's difficult to overstate just how crushing this stigma was. The ETA were trapped in a permanent underclass, with no hope of ever rising above their despised status. They were the lowest of the low in a society that was already brutally stratified. And yet their labor was still essential to the functioning of that society. Someone had to tan the animal hides, butcher the meat, dig the graves, but no one wanted to acknowledge or associate with the hapless souls who performed these necessary but unseemly tasks. Imagine the hardscrabble life of an ETA family, forever consigned to the margins of society. Perhaps they ran a small tannery, scraping and curing animal hides to be made into leather. It was foul, back-breaking work, with caustic chemicals that burned the skin and noxious fumes that seared the lungs. And yet, it put food on the table, meager though it might be. The tannery would be located in the ETA quarter, a ramshackle hamlet of tumble-down huts on the far fringes of the village. The stench of rotting carcasses and fermenting hides would hang heavy in the air, an olfactory barrier that warned the rest of the villagers to keep their distance. Here, the ETA would toil from sunup to sundown, their hands permanently stained with the slaughterhouse muck. Perhaps the tanner had a daughter, a bright and beautiful girl who dreamed of a better life beyond the confines of the Ita quarter. But she knew it was an impossible fantasy. Her status as an untouchable was immutable, a curse passed down through the generations. She would likely marry another eater, bear eater children, and watch them struggle against the same merciless stigma that had always shackled her people. And yet, even in this bleakest of circumstances, the Ite clung to their dignity, their humanity. They formed tight-knit communities, bound together by their shared hardship and their stubborn refusal to let the dominant society crush their spirit. They found solace in their own rituals and traditions, in the quiet moments of grace that could still bloom amidst the unrelenting discrimination. But make no mistake, life for the Ite was a brutal, soul-crushing existence. They bore the cruelest brunt of feudal Japan's rigid hierarchy, forever relegated to the shadows and cesspits of society. Their suffering was immense and unceasing, a testament to the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. And so the social fabric of feudal Japan was woven, with each thread in its designated place, from the gleaming heights of the imperial court to the squalid depths of the Ite quarters. It was a tapestry of astonishing intricacy and shocking inequity, where the accident of birth determined one's entire life course. The samurai ruled with an iron fist, the peasants toiled in perpetual servitude, the artisans and merchants scraped by under suffocating regulation, and the Ite were ground into the very dirt beneath society's feet. But perhaps most tragic of all was the way this rigid hierarchy was justified and reinforced by the prevailing philosophies of the time. Neo-Confucianism, with its emphasis on social order and knowing one's place, provided a tidy cosmological framework for keeping everyone in their designated slot. Buddhism, while ostensibly offering a path to enlightenment for all, often reinforced the notion of karmic destiny. If you were born a peasant or an Ite, it must be because of your actions in a past life. Even the native Shinto religion, with its countless gods and spirits, was co-opted by the ruling classes to bolster their authority. The emperor was said to be descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu herself, a divine lineage that granted him unquestionable legitimacy. The samurai, too, claimed a sacred mandate, with their rigidly enforced code of Bushido rooted in quasi-religious notions of honor, loyalty, and noble self-sacrifice. Against this formidable backdrop of religious and philosophical justification, it's no wonder that feudal Japan's social hierarchy remained so entrenched for so long. When every aspect of the cosmos seemed to ordain the existing order, when even the gods themselves appeared to sanction the suffering of the lowly, it took an almost superhuman act of will to imagine anything different. And yet, despite the unrelenting brutality of the age, glimmers of light still managed to pierce the gloom. There were always those who yearned for something more, who dared to dream of a world beyond the suffocating confines of the feudal order. Sometimes these dreamers were quashed and silenced, ground under the heel of the status quo. But sometimes, against all odds, they managed to kindle a spark of change. Perhaps it was a samurai who questioned the rigid code of Bushido, who saw the humanity in even the lowliest peasant or the despised Ite, or a merchant who used his wealth to support the arts and learning, who created spaces for free thought and creativity amidst the stultifying conformity of the age. Or a peasant who, through sheer force of will and ingenuity, managed to rise above his allotted station, to carve out a small slice of autonomy in a world that would grant him none. These acts of defiance and self-assertion, however small or fleeting, were the seedlings of change. They held within them the promise of a different way, a hint of the transformation that was to come. For feudal Japan, as mighty and immovable as it seemed, was not eternal. No social order, however deeply entrenched, can last forever in the face of the irrepressible human spirit. But change, when it came, would not come easily. The road from feudal rigidity to modern dynamism was a long and bloody one. paved with the bones of countless martyrs and revolutionaries. It would take the wrenching upheaval of the Meiji Restoration, the shattering of the samurai class, the total overhaul of the political and economic order, to drag Japan kicking and screaming into the modern age. And even then, the legacy of those feudal centuries would linger long in the national psyche. The values of conformity, of knowing one's place, of sublimating the individual to the group, these would prove stubborn weeds with deep roots in the cultural soil. Even as Japan transformed itself on the surface, becoming an industrial and military powerhouse on the world stage, those ancient hierarchies still lurked in the shadows, shaping society in subtle but profound ways. But that is a tale for another time. For now, let us take a final, lingering look back at the world of feudal Japan in all its harrowing brutality, its rigid elegance, its aching, stifled humanity. It was a world of exquisite beauty and unspeakable cruelty, of soaring triumphs and crushing despair. A world where the accident of birth could seal one's fate as surely as the sword, where life was at once cheap and infinitely precious. As we contemplate this lost world, this strange and distant mirror of our own, perhaps we can find within it some glimmer of recognition. For the human experience, in all its sorrow and glory, its suffering and transcendence, is never wholly foreign to us, no matter how far removed in time and space. The ghosts of feudal Japan, long dead and gone to dust, still whisper to us across the ages, their stories aching to be heard. So let us listen and remember. Let us honor the lives that were ground down by the iniquities of the age, the dreams that were crushed under the weight of oppressive hierarchy. And let us learn too from their hard-won victories, their stubborn resilience, their unquenchable spark of hope in the face of overwhelming despair. For in the end, the lesson of feudal Japan is not just one of unrelenting darkness, but also of the indomitable human spirit that can never be wholly extinguished. It is a reminder that even in the most suffocating of circumstances, the yearning for freedom, for dignity, for a better world can never be entirely suppressed. And that ultimately is the most enduring legacy of this strange and tragic era, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and its indefatigable capacity for hope. And with that thought, we come to the end of our journey through the dark annals of feudal Japan. It has been a harrowing voyage, replete with tales of brutality, oppression, and unspeakable suffering. But it has also been shot through with glimmers of light, of courage, compassion, and the inextinguishable spark of human dignity. As we close the book on this chapter of history, let us do so with a renewed appreciation for the blessings of our own time and a deepened empathy for those who came before us. And if you found these tales of a bygone age strangely soothing in their distant tragedy, perhaps you'll consider drifting off to sleep with the weight of history as your lullaby. After all, there is a certain peace to be found in contemplating the vast sweep of human experience in all its sorrow and splendor. It puts our own trials and triumphs in perspective and reminds us of the fleeting nature of all earthly things. So rest now and let the echoes of old Japan carry you off to slumber. And if you enjoyed this sojourn into the darker corners of history, do consider subscribing to this channel. There are always more untold tales waiting to be unspooled. But for now, good night, and may your dreams be untroubled by the ghosts of feudal Japan. They have lingered long enough in the shadows of memory. Let us grant them at last the peace of a quiet repose. As we've seen, life for the vast majority in feudal Japan was defined by backbreaking labor, grinding poverty, and a rigid social order that offered little hope of a better future. The unrelenting struggle to survive consumed nearly every waking hour, with each day blurring into the next in an endless cycle of toil and privation. For the peasants who made up the bulk of the population, existence was particularly grim. They were essentially serfs, bound to the land they worked and subject to the often capricious whims of their local lords. Rising before dawn, they would labor in the fields until dusk, coaxing what meager sustenance they could from the earth. The fruits of their labor, however, were never fully their own. A crushing tax burden ensured that the lion's share of any harvest went to fill the coffers of the local daimyo and samurai class. Payments were due in rice and other crops, leaving peasant families with barely enough to survive on. In lean years when harvests were poor, many faced the spectre of starvation. Even in good times, most lived on the knife's edge of subsistence, forever one failed crop away from destitution. This precarity was compounded by the fact that peasants enjoyed very little in the way of rights or legal protections. The strict codes that governed feudal society placed them firmly at the bottom of the hierarchy, their lives considered expendable by those above them. Samurai, who served as the enforcers of this rigid order, could strike down a peasant with impunity for any perceived slight or breach of etiquette. A vicious cycle of poverty made this oppression nearly impossible to escape. Denied education and opportunities for advancement, peasants were locked into their subservient status from birth. The scant surplus their labor generated was quickly siphoned off by rents and taxes, leaving no path to accumulate even modest wealth or holdings. The weight of this system bore down across generations, each born into the same misery as the last. Desperate families might sell children into servitude or prostitution when times grew lean, forever rending their most precious bonds for a few coins to ward off starvation. Even the relative security of a peasant village offered little sanctuary from the upheavals of the era. Rival warlords vying for supremacy frequently clashed in the provinces, their armies living off the land as they marched. For villagers caught in their path, this could spell disaster as homes were razed, food stores plundered, and loved ones cut down by uncaring blades. The story of the Sato family, humble rice farmers living in the shadow of Mount Fuji in the early 1600s, illustrates the fragile lives of the peasantry. For generations, the Satos had worked the same small plot, eking out a meager living. Goro, the aging patriarch, could trace his lineage back countless generations, all battling the same unforgiving earth. That year, as the summer stretched on without rain, their rice paddies slowly withered under the merciless sun. By harvest time, only stunted grains emerged from the cracked earth, a mere fraction of the usual crop. With heavy hearts, the family measured out their portion, setting aside the rest for the tax collector. What remained was scarcely enough to last the winter. As hunger gnawed at their bellies in the cold months that followed, Goro and his wife Miyako grew increasingly desperate. Their two young sons were listless, wasting away before their eyes. Miyako begged Goro to keep some rice from the tax payment, but he knew failing to pay in full could spell even worse disaster, having witnessed neighbors dragged off and beaten severely for short payments. In the end, they did what they had to do to survive. With no coins to buy food, the only thing of value the family had left was their daughter Akiko's youth and beauty. One dark night, Miyako bundled up the frightened 12-year-old and, choking back sobs, delivered her to the village brothel. The paltry sum she received in return would be enough to buy a few more months of meager food. But the family would never be whole again. Akiko's fate was all too common for vulnerable peasant girls of the time. Sold into servitude or brothels by desperate families, their brief lives were marked by exploitation and abuse. Seen as little more than chattel, they enjoyed no semblance of autonomy or legal protections. Beaten down and often gravely ill, few survived long in the harrowing conditions of the time. The trauma of Akiko's loss shattered the already strained Sato family. Mere months later, Goro's aged body finally gave out, collapsing in the paddies he had tended his whole life. Miyako would follow before the year was out, wasting away from grief and hunger. The two young boys, now orphaned, were left to fend for themselves, their fates uncertain in the tumult of the times. While the Sato's tale is fictional, it echoes the real accounts that survive of peasant hardship during the period, and it underscores the bitter irony of the era, that those who toiled the hardest reaped the least rewards, forever locked out of the comforts and securities enjoyed by the ruling class. As we reflect on the immense suffering and injustice experienced by the common people of feudal Japan, it's worth remembering that their story is not entirely unique. Across the centuries and spanning the globe, rigid hierarchies that concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a chosen few have often spelled misery for the masses below. Yet we can take some solace in the fact that change, however slowly, did come to Japan. The feudal order that had endured for so long finally began to fracture in the 19th century, buckling under the weight of its own contradictions and the rising pushes of modernization. In the tumultuous decades that followed, Japan would transform itself, the old ways crumbling before the relentless march of progress. The road ahead would not be an easy one, with new trials and upheavals waiting in the wings of history. But it was a path forward, out of the stifling confines of the feudal past and into a new era where the possibility of a better life flickered on the horizon. As we close this chapter on the often brutal realities of feudal Japan, the hushed sounds of the night beckon you towards restful slumber. Let your mind drift off into the waiting embrace of sleep, the cares of the long ago fading like mist beneath the rising sun. And if you found this journey through history an intriguing companion on your nightly voyages, consider giving this video a gentle tap of the like button and a drowsy click of the subscribe link. Until next, our paths cross on the dusky roads of the past. I bid you the very sweetest of dreams. Good night.